So, folks, this is a topic that is so near and dear to my heart this morning. And it's funny because if you don't know what it is, Mike sometimes will talk about warm and fuzzy. For me, I'm not a warm and fuzzy kind of teacher, but this is really something for us at this particular moment in time that I think for teachers is an essential topic. So we'll kind of build, or we'll kind of look at some of the stuff that Mike had referenced yesterday, those of you that were with us, in terms of the growth mindset and the fostering of resiliency. And several of you folks, like I know very, very well personally, so I can tell you that this is something, believe it or not, when we're looking in terms of resiliency, the most significant thing to keep in mind is this, for us as educators. The more resilient resiliency the teacher possesses, the more resilient the learners in your classroom will become. So this is really about you today. This is a focus for us as educators. And hopefully, it is definitely, as like I said, a warmer, kind of like a more affective topic. But there is a lot there. We're talking about 35 to 40 years of research supporting the whole notion and concept of resiliency. So our housework, our housekeeping stuff here first, please. Honestly, it's such a nice, small, intimate group that we're going to be doing a lot of sharing. So where you have your microphone, feel free, like Mike would probably yell, but I think with 15 people in, I think we should be fine for everyone to be unmuted. But when you want to go speak, please just click on your microphone to unmute. Mike and Renee will moderate, but feel free with a group this size, ask any questions as we go. You can put them in the chat, or you can just unmute and then ask the questions. We will have a question and answer session at the end. There will be a recorded version. Mike's been so timely with these. Usually later on today, they'll be up, as well as the slides, because there is even a resiliency quiz that you can take to determine, am I resilient? Yes or no. For those of you that are joining us that we haven't seen you all up before, please go up to your participant or kind of hover up by your name and use the rename feature on the Zoom bar, and you can just put your school initials. Like most of you folks, I think I know where you're from, but just in case, because we are sending these as a big compiled list to your district so that they see like, oh, Jeff has 4 hours of Act 48 accumulated already at this point. So I did say this is a topic near and dear to my heart. Over to the left, and so I'm a hidden warm and fuzzy person, very, very empathetic, but some of us kind of like don't wear our hearts on our sleeves, so to speak. So when we talk about resiliency, very, very first, I have the little visual over on the left-hand side, if you can see that, with the strengths and weaknesses. And what happens with resiliency, folks, especially for us as educators, because we're such perfectionists, the majority of us, is that we tend to perseverate and really focus on our weaknesses, whether they be personal traits or like in the classroom traits. And resiliency is about focusing on your strengths. And what can you take what you already do and do effectively and model that and for your children in the classroom, but even more importantly, how does it make you feel at home? So if everybody could unmute, like just a little round robin discussion here. This topic is resiliency. And in your own words, folks, when you think or hear the word, read the word resiliency, and this is very timely for us, what does that mean to you? Anybody speak up. Resiliency.
Being able to bounce back after a setback.
Being able to bounce back after a setback. Perfect. Who else?
Taking chances in life.
Good. To take chances in life. And I say this sincerely as an educator myself. A lot of us that go into education believe that there's like a linear path. And those of us that have experienced a lot of, perhaps maybe even we'll talk briefly about adverse childhood experiences. Lynn, like I'm looking at you, you're in my window, you're having some health issues. I mean, we won't go into it specifically, but things like that can definitely sap our resiliency. So the bouncing back might not look immediate. For some of us, it might take us, research-based, it might take us like years to rebound. But there are things that we can do as daily affirmations that do foster resiliency. How about one more person? Jeff, I think I saw Jeff in here. Jeff, resiliency, what's that mean to you?
I pretty much had the same exact thing as the first person said. Mine was just ability to bounce back.
Okay. So I'm really gonna, and this is really about self-exploration, folks, and being honest about ourselves. I think we know our strengths. For some of us don't acknowledge our strengths, but we're very good with our weaknesses or what we need to repair or work upon. If you want to go down just to, how about down to you could do the yes or no, which is with your participant hovered by your name again. Yes, if you believe collectively you are more resilient than non-resilient. No, and I call this the Eeyore. If you feel like you have a lot of days where you're Eeyore, well, why do I even bother? So resiliency is not a linear approach. As I said, it's something very fluid. So we all have bad days. But I'd like you to go and to your participant and mark, are you resilient more often than not? That would be yes. Check the yes. If not, check the no. And let me take a look. Well, Mike feels that he's very resilient. So folks, are you with us? Okay. No one, I don't see any Eeyores yet. Some of you didn't weigh in yet. Nice. So resiliency for us as educators, I have to tell you, is a skill that we need to live and breathe. And the more that we actually own it and it becomes more innate in us, the more we can actually pass those traits and some of that modeling along to our kids, whether it be our own children at home or the children that we're working with. So our singular target is that we're exploring the research behind resiliency. There are a lot of folks writing a lot of books about this topic, but honestly, the bulk of it was by Nan Henderson. She was one of the first and foremost authorities on this. So I'm referencing a lot of her work, but if I'm shifting gears like to Horacio Sanchez, some of these more current researchers, I'll let you know.
Diane, a question coming in from chat from
Yes.
Helen.
Okay.
Is resiliency situational?
Absolutely. What a great question. Resiliency, and some of us, as I said, we're going to take a look very briefly at some ACE or adverse childhood experiences. Resiliency does not mean that we live the golden life. Resiliency for some of us, like I've had a lot of health issues myself, it definitely is situational. And the understanding, the more you understand this as an educator, and as for us as adults and as adult learners, is that it will ebb and flow. So that there are moments, absolutely, where there are situations where you feel really knocked back on your heels, so to speak, and that's absolutely okay. Resiliency is not like the bouncy ball that some of the early researchers would say, oh, so if Diane has, great modeling, we're going to talk a lot this morning about the resiliency protective factors. And one of the primary protective factors are people that help us through rough spots, through the situations that are very stressful. Believe it or not, guess who they are? Guess what the occupation is? Teachers. So teachers are seen in 75% of the research, 75% of the resiliency protective factor can be attributed to educators. And this is very fascinating as you read more and more, folks, because oftentimes you're not even aware that you are acting as a model and a protective factor for children that are in your classroom. And you might hear about it 10 years down the road. So it's a very, very significant topic, and it is in that affective domain. So sometimes it doesn't get its just dessert. I have to tell you, we're not going to focus or linger here on the next slide too long, because this is about how do we turn this around. But there is something, a lot of you that are into either the positive school-wide behavior, or I train a course in Penn through teaching children of trauma and the techniques and the things that you do. Any school climate, positive behavior programs are going to talk about the adverse childhood experiences. And there is a quiz even that you can take But I have to tell you that this is about how do we overcome a lot of these obstacles versus what is the impact. But I would be remiss if I just didn't mention briefly, it is situational, as we were already addressed, a question was already addressed. The impact of what occurs in our life, particularly in your childhood experiences, definitely can be life altering. Okay, there is a trauma or the ACE quiz, and I just kind of compiled for you, and take a look at my bottom, the last one. But these are some things. Trauma is viewed as an exceptional experience, not exceptional like, whoa, that's wonderful, but it's beyond exception. And it can really overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. And so I know, hopefully, we don't have a lot of these, but these are seen as some of the major ACE or the adverse experiences that can impact us into adulthood. But that's not necessarily like that it's set in stone. I personally, for instance, had substance abuse in my home as a child growing up. That doesn't mean that you are destined or determined to be unable to cope. The idea with the ACE quiz and kind of exploring that type of the childhood experiences is that it makes you much more attuned to yourself or to your learners in the classroom. Oftentimes with children, we see someone acting out and think, oh, they want attention, or, oh, you know, this child, they probably truly, if we don't know the background and the scenario, you know, what's happening at home, it's very likely that they're really not able to cope, and that their resiliency, the factors, they don't have a lot of protective factors. So I placed on my, just kind of looking at the types of things that can influence us, pandemic or a natural disaster. Particularly the things for us that are situational that we have no control over can really raise that level of concern. So I don't want to focus on the trauma, but these are some of the items that if you're taking the ACE, and there are tons of these free assessments online, they talk about the ACE score. So just looking at some of these components I have listed, if your score of ACE is 2 or higher, it puts you more at risk, meaning that you'll have difficulty coping. And just us as adults, this is something that's very personal. I'm not going to ask you to tally for me, but there are 5 on here that actually I would fall into those categories. So it's not necessarily a sentence of what is to come in the future if you are working with resiliency and a lot of the coping factors. So folks, I wanted to get us started with a little, I think there was a TV show, it didn't last too long, What Would You Do? But I have a scenario, and we're gonna go ahead and unmute everybody. But I have 2 situations here, and the one is, it's kind of like interesting for us, because if you even have children at home and they have something happens to them and they seem so flustered and so upset by it, and yet we're kind of like, you might be like, oh, get over it. So a trauma doesn't have to be a major life-altering event that can lead to or our lack of resiliency. But as we unmute, our first situation, a longtime friend has ghosted you and you have no idea why. What would you do? Let's talk about this for a second. Ghosted meaning that's like they just disappeared. So you were very close, and then all at once you vanished. What you do actually speaks volumes to your resiliency and the level of resiliency you possess. So who would like to share? Go ahead and unmute and share with us. We're just talking this out for a second.
I would probably just call them to check in on them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you would be proactive. So you would call them and check in on them.
Yes.
Very, very nice. Jeff, I know you well enough. You're not going to be antagonistic about it either, are you?
No.
Yeah, you're not, hey, what's up? I haven't heard from you. Anyone else have a different response?
This actually happened to us. We had a friend who that happened. We didn't know what. So we called him a couple of times and no response. And we just waited until they got back in contact with us, which was a couple of years later, and just his life took a different turn.
Okay. And it's interesting. I love that response, Jen, because oftentimes when we are trying to cope or having difficulty coping in terms of resiliency, we accept 100% of the blame, or that it must be something, surely something that we did, and that's not necessarily the case. So very, very, very nice. And some of us, I mean, those of you that know me, Stacy, how would I react to this scenario? I asked Stacy or like Renee, because they know me very well.
I think that you would just, Diane, I think you would just approach the person face head on and just be like, what's going on? You know, why are you ghosting me type thing. I think you would be very confrontational.
I told you.
I think you would be bluntly honest.
You guys, you two of all, you know me quite well. And not in an antagonistic way, but very, very blunt. So like Renee and I work together, and Renee is a very affective domain person. So I can make a statement, and she's really learned how to navigate Diane. But initially, there's definitely there can be hurt feelings. So
well, there's still times, Diane, I wonder.
And I'm not, it's out of love. It's always out of love. But a resilient person, when someone is ghosting you, you're probably going to, like Jeff would be much more subtle about it, but you're going to find out what's going on. Those of us that sometimes our resiliency wanes are the folks that, and that's interesting, Jen, it sounded like a different scenario for you, but it's not always about us. It might be the other individual that we're working with that's having the issue, that they're having trouble coping. So a lot of people that struggle with resiliency take on everyone's weight of the world, so to speak. That's difficult as educators, isn't it? I'm sure there are days when you go home and you just feel like you could cry for some of the children that you're working with. That means that you really have to work on yourself and make sure that you're fostering resiliency, or it can really bring you down. This next one I love, because I think the next scenario I developed, you're working 10-hour days and still have to work to finish each night. What would you do? Anyone want to share? So what's your factor here, or what do you do? Jennifer, what do you do?
I think I would just plow through it. I would just tend to think that it was kind of a short-term stressor to get to my goal.
Excellent. You know, Jen, we're the same personality. I tend to, in fact, the only issue is if you're doing it consistently, because we as teachers, sometimes we have deadlines, absolutely, we have to meet. Does anyone feel like they never get out of this mode? That you have this and it's a consistent basis?
Me. Sometimes I feel like I tread water from the first day of school to the last day of school.
And you know, I have to tell you, thank you for your honesty, because it doesn't mean that you're not working hard or you're not doing a great job. What it means is you are definitely a teacher then that kind of takes, or you assume a lot of the effort and as well as the blame when it comes forth. And I know it's easy for me to say, but we've been working very, very long days, but I'm kind of like Jen. I know that there's an end in sight. I know that we will be getting back to normalcy. So that's the resilient mindset, when you just feel like I'm never going to get out of there. And what it means, Becky, I think it was Becky that responded, you're a very empathetic person. And so taking empathy means sometimes it can be absolutely overwhelming. And so we really need to take time for ourselves. Okay? Hey, folks, I have a little simple activity for us. This is one, by the way, you could interchange any faces, any folks that you'd want to do here with your own kids. So I could see, you don't have to say to children, let's talk about resiliency, boys and girls. But with us, I'm being very transparent for you because we're adults. I have 4 pictures here, random people. So I think you probably at least can name 3 of these 4 very, very readily. How about in the chat bar? So it's a quick share out. How about in the chat bar, please? Upper left, who is that? Type in the name if you know. If you don't know, I think you're probably from another planet. Okay, so Helen, I think Helen's with us. Helen, who is that upper left?
Oprah, no last name needed.
That's a very flattering picture of her too. I'm sure she'd appreciate the flattering picture. How about the upper right? Who is that, folks? Raise your hand because I don't want to call upon someone if you're like, oh, I'm not sure. So who is that? I'm not saying hands raised. And folks, to raise your hand now, we should have, Mike, it's not on mine, but that's okay.
You won't have the reactions.
Oh,
and the
that's right.
reactions
That's right.
only have thumbs up and applause. There is
Thank
no
you.
hand raising there.
Yeah, so I'm sorry. I always forget that. That's why I have Mike and Renee to keep me straight. So I can't do the thumbs up or raise my hand and so on. But so that is Stephen King. Jeff says, that's Mike, our retired custodian. Might be similar in appearance, okay? Oprah Winfrey Street, Stephen King, lower left-hand corner. Who is that? Some of my novels, folks that love to read. That is...
Oh, is that J.K. Rowling?
Very, very nice. That is a very attractive picture. See, I'm kind. I didn't find these ugly looking photos of him. That is J.K. Rowling. Very, very good. A novelist. And lower right, who is that? That's the one I thought you might not know who he is.
Oh, I think I know who that is. Oh,
Who
yeah,
is that, Mike?
it's in the chat. People have already answered.
Okay, good. Well,
Ben.
you know I can't manage chat, all these things together.
Well,
I'm
everybody
real
has the right answer. It's Ben Carson.
Good. That's Dr. Benjamin Carson. So I didn't just randomly select these folks. These, in my mind, but I've also read extensively about these people. These, in my mind, are kind of like models of resiliency. So you may or may not know, you might not have like a really, oh, I know a lot of biography, or information about J.K. Rowling. But what I'd like to do, because this is also an online activity that you could use with your kids, is I've named this activity 7 then 3. So what we're going to do is, with your team, and you will have an assigned team, resiliency, by the way, is not fostered, and I know what we're going to create a resiliency board today, almost like an inspirational board for us, but resiliency typically requires someone else to help you foster it. Some of us, like Mike, might be a very resilient person on his own and in his response to scenarios or situations. But for those of us that struggle, it's always going to be better when you're not in isolation. So the 7 and 3 activity, I'm going to kind of break you into groups, and you're going to have 7 minutes. And I said research here, because with kids, you probably have to tell them, for instance, who the pictures are of, whatever pictures you're using. But then you're going to converse and come up with at least 2 reasons why I have these famous faces as an example of resiliency. So if you know a lot about the individuals, you can just feel free to share. If Helen gets in a group and she's kind of like, oh, I don't know much about Ben Carson, then of course, feel free to Google, okay? Use your phone, use your laptop, well, use each other. The fostering of resiliency is usually done to foster it within a team or collaborative environments versus in isolation. So that's very important. So what we're going to do, because we have 4 folks, is I'm going to take and I'm going to place folks into breakout rooms, and they will just be random breakout rooms today. And what I'll do is, when you get in there, when you see the kind of like the little toggle, or like it looks like a jelly bean, just join your room and you will get 7 minutes to discuss your individual. What I'd like to do, hold on, I think I can do it, yes. So I'm going to put the names, so the first breakout room, I'm going to type Oprah there so that you'll know whom you're discussing. Breakout room 2, I'm going to go ahead and rename that Ben Carson, just so that you can remember and so you'll know. So we're not all looking at all of these folks. Breakout room number 3, I'm going to go ahead and name that, if I can rename it. Yes. Stephen King. And then our last breakout room, who has a good memory? Who was our last one?
J.K. Rowling.
J.K. Rowling, thank you. Okay, folks, so you're going to have 7 minutes and I will time it. I'll give you a 6-minute notice. But what you're doing is, please prepare someone that they will be the random reporter when we come back. So you will share out your 2 tidbits of information. So I didn't just randomly select these folks. These are models of resiliency. So whether you want to talk it out or research it, that's up to you. Okay? So you're going to be broken off into your rooms now, and I'll see you in 7 minutes.
Hey, everybody.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
So why do you think Diane chose Ben?
Didn't he grow up in the projects, kind of like in poverty?
I believe so. And I think that's why there's always a question of why he's for housing and urban development. And I think
Yeah.
that was part of it. You know, because
Yeah.
I think he's a brain surgeon, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah, a
believe.
neurosurgeon.
Yeah, he's an author and retired neurosurgeon.
Yeah, but I believe he started out with a single mother and in poverty, and managed to make his way into college despite the way he grew up and become a surgeon and such.
Just doing a little bit of reading here on him. His mother was 13 and his father was 28 when they were married.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah. Also, father was in the military, so moved from Tennessee to Detroit. Public school kid that went to school in Detroit.
I mean, I just read something about him in 5th grade. He was viewed as the, quote, dumbest kid. And then by 6th grade, he was moved to the top of his class once he was introduced to books. So I think that's a good example of overcoming something.
And his college SAT scores ranked him somewhere in the low 90th percentile.
Right, but it was the highest of any student in Detroit public schools.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just saw here that his mother, later on, will find out that his dad had another family, so they divorced. Mom attempted suicide, had several psychiatric hospitalizations for depression.
Wow. So he had to overcome a lot.
Yeah, it looks like that family-wise.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm reading here that when he went to medical school, that he did so poorly on his first exams that his advisor recommended that he dropped out.
Yeah.
So he left there and went to Johns Hopkins.
Yep.
Yeah, that's.
Gosh, he was held up at gunpoint at a Popeyes in Baltimore at one point.
Yeah.
When he was at Johns Hopkins. Yeah, he's had a lot of adversity.
Yes,
Yeah.
he has.
And he's still smiling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a bunch of reasons.
So she's going to give us 3 minutes. So what are the highlights? Do we want to do like the family struggles?
Yeah.
And then the academic struggles?
I think that's good.
Yep.
You know, and I mean, then if we look at, you know, he ran for president, I think in the 2016 election.
Right.
And for a while, he was very popular.
In the beginning part.
Right.
Yeah.
And then he kind of fell off.
Mm-hmm.
And then he ended up, you know, getting appointed to a position anyway.
Yeah.
So I guess that's another kind of resilience thing, that even though he didn't make it, he still was put in a position where he can work to better a constituency that he understands, the people that live in that urban housing.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else we're supposed to share other than why they're resilient?
I don't think so. I think it was just those 4 or 2 reasons.
Yeah,
Okay.
why she would have
Yeah.
chose him.
Right. I'll be interested to hear what like J.K. Rowling and, like, I don't know, did she offer Harry Potter to different publishers that turned her down or something like that? And I know Stephen King got hit by a car, what was that, like 10 years ago or whatever, and was nearly killed and had to fight back from that.
Mm.
And I believe Oprah was sexually abused as a child.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I don't think she had a great family life growing up either. So
I teach psychology, and I use that when we talk about defense mechanisms, like the id, the ego, superego of Sigmund Freud. I use that. She's one of my examples, because she completely forgot about her being abused until later, so she repressed that information.
Oh. All right. Well, she called us back. I'm going to head back.
Okay, folks, how are we doing?
Terrific.
My view changed. Mike, is everybody back in now?
Looks like you got most of them.
I was going to say my view kind of changed, which kind of threw me for a loop for a second, like the showing on the screen. But I'm seeing folks back now. Okay. Okay. So how many of you had difficulty with that activity with the person that you were assigned? Let's see what we came up with. Oprah, who is our random reporter from the Oprah group? Please share.
That's me, Diane.
Okay. Hi, Jen.
Hi. We talked about how she had a really challenging childhood growing up, but then it's not like life got easier for her. She struggled with weight issues, just being a top person in the industry as a Black female. Like both of those things being a challenge. So she overcame challenges as a child, but then continued to have challenges in adulthood.
Wonderful. And it's a great example or case in point, Jen, because she had a lot of trauma, a lot of ACE. But when you think of Oprah, do you think of Oprah as a failure or someone that's struggled throughout her life?
No, because she's someone, yes, she struggled throughout her life, but then every obstacle that she has faced, she has overcome to kind of, get farther.
Excellent. So folks, not only is it for us for a second to kind of like you're exploring or kind of talking about folks that possess resiliency, but just so as a sidebar for you when working with kids, the subtlest way, the most effective way to get kids to like where you're modeling and fostering and talking about resiliency is to read about examples of resilient people. Also to look at literature, and we're going to look at a piece of poetry, to look at literature that it has a very resilient, kind of like an uplifting type. So we can't lecture or preach, particularly to adults or children, but looking at like the sports one I always use is Michael Jordan. He was not a successful basketball player. He ended up being quite successful. So having even kids, your kids at any grade level, dig into examples of resiliency is very effective, a very great, easy technique. How about our Ben Carson group? Who was our random reporter? Just unmute your mic and share.
We didn't nominate a random reporter.
Uh-oh.
So I guess I since no one else stepped forward, you'll get to hear from me.
I guess it's
I'm
Mike.
sure thrills everyone. So we really talked about two aspects of his life where he kind of faced adversity and things didn't look so great. His family story is really interesting in that his father was 15 years older than his mother. The dad was 28, mom was 13 when they got married.
Yep.
They bounced around a whole lot, eventually ending up in Detroit. And he did not do well initially. Everybody thought he was kind of, I think we said in 5th grade, he was considered the dumbest kid in the class. And by 6th grade, he was the smartest. He actually had at the time, when he took his SATs, it was the highest SAT score ever in the Detroit public schools at the time, which would have been probably in the late 60s, early 70s. He actually had trouble in medical school too. He first went to school in Michigan, and his advisor after the first semester said, you're not cut out for this. And he ended up going to Johns Hopkins. He was actually held up at gunpoint at a Popeyes when he was in medical school too. So we looked at his home life and then his education. I think I'm still under the 3 minutes, but we also then talked about how he kind of rebounded, and even the political aspect of running for president. He was very popular, and then the wheels kind of fell off, but he ended up in an appointed position. And, for housing and urban development, and people say, well, he's a neuroscience, he's a doctor, a brain surgeon. Why is he there? But I think given his background, that was probably why he was interested in that position.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. So in Oprah's case, she will tell you anything that you're reading about her, that her protective factor or resiliency factor were her teachers and her faith. In Ben Carson's case, he will tell you, it's a touching story. His mother was illiterate. She could not read or write, but his mother was his protective factor in really enforcing and really encouraging him in the educational realm. So very nice. How about Stephen King? That one might not have seemed so obvious. Who was our random reporter for the Stephen King group? Who was in the Stephen King group?
We didn't pick a random reporter either, but I'll do it.
Okay.
We found out that his dad left the family when he was 2 years old.
Good.
And so he moved around with his mom, and they had a lot of financial strain. It said he had lost belief in God, I think, as a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
His mom died of cancer when he was in his 20s. He couldn't get a job as a teacher. And also when he was young, he witnessed the death of a friend that had traumatized him. He began writing at the age of 7, and he loved writing so much that he wrote every day of the year except for Christmas, and I can't remember the other day. We talked about maybe the fact that he had all this trauma early in his life the writing helped him with his resiliency and helped him to use that as an escape, because it said a lot of his writing was autobiographical based on some of the events that he had.
Excellent. You nailed that, Sarah. So, Sarah, if I were using the term the resiliency protective factor for Stephen King, it wasn't necessarily a person. What was it?
His writing.
Yeah, his writing. Absolutely. Very, very nice. Last but not least, J.K. Rowling. So did you select a random reporter group, or is someone just going to have to step up?
Yeah, I got voluntold in the chat, so I'm good. So for J.K. Rowling, she had a pretty typical childhood, although her mother was diagnosed with MS when she was a teen, but she was always surrounded by books and found her love of writing very early on in life. But what is pretty unique about her is that she always wanted to be a writer and found herself in life circumstances where she was a single mother of 2, literally on government assistance, but she could not let go of that dream of being a writer. She had the books kind of mapped out, and she kept sending her manuscripts to publishers. She got rejected over a dozen times before she finally found a publisher willing to take a chance on her. So she didn't let go of that dream of being a writer, even though she was in these circumstances where most people would have just said, I need to find something that I can eat on.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Wonderful. So I really selected carefully so you folks can see. So with rolling, and someone had asked, that's situational. It was definitely like, it was kind of like, oh, there wasn't a lot of ACE or adverse experiences as a younger child, but divorce, which I can attest to, definitely can be a trauma, and it's how do you rebound or how do you combat? So her protective factor was a little different. Hers was her dream. Very, very nice, Helen, and the aspiration that she had. So if I asked you folks, and I would not, this is incredibly personal, but do you have a protective factor for yourself personally? It might be a person. I love to garden. It might be an activity. It might be something that you really enjoy doing. It might be your faith, but it is for those that foster, or those people that have a high kind of like bounce back rate or level of resiliency. They are folks that know themselves. And so I put a little Socrates on here for us with the next slide. Knowing yourself, and there are a couple little things, and all of this information is shared with you folks, as well as a quiz. If you're really curious, like I want to take this quiz and see where I fall on this resiliency factor wheel. Identifying your strengths is where we really begin. So that when you do encounter something that might consider trauma or throws us off track, that it really helps. So those individuals that you just talked about, you did a beautiful job, all had things that were considered to be protective factors. So you can have kids as well as yourself, but I really think we start with ourselves when you're taking a look at resiliency. And so there is a resiliency attitude. This would be a quote that I would have in my classroom if I had a classroom. And it's, I love his work also on resiliency, Horacio Sanchez, but the quote is very powerful. What is right with you is more powerful than anything wrong with you. And I think that's a message that oftentimes we need to remind ourselves of. So as we get closer to the end, and I'm going to talk about like a resiliency board, you're definitely going to be like, oh, is this something off Pinterest? But the notion behind the acknowledgement of our strengths is so powerful for us. So these are, if you were to take, and there is a resiliency quiz, as I said, that's linked here, but if you were to take a look at these, all of us possess at least 2 or 3, hopefully, of the list that are really our strengths, and that they're our go-to. So everybody is different, just as those famous faces were different. Some of us, like Rolling, definitely, I would say, wow, look at her perseverance. It's interesting when Mike was displaying or talking about Ben Carson, because my daughter was told her freshman year of med school, they found out that she had a learning disability, not till her first year in med school, that she probably wouldn't make it, and that she probably should think about seeking elsewhere rather than paying all that money. And she is a second-year resident, surgical resident, and enjoys it very much so. So you can look at the kids in your classroom, and you can probably identify their strengths. That's much more powerful for ourselves as well. Like if you have a love of learning, I love to read. That would definitely be one of the strengths. So when you're being kind of knocked off guard, so to speak, the idea is to weigh in upon some of your strengths and your resiliency builders. And by the way, avoiding folks, if you can, that kind of like suck the life out of you, so to speak. In the educational realm, I wanted just to show you this very briefly, but each one of these weak components this is the Nan Henderson work on resiliency in the wheel. There are factors educationally in our classrooms, in our school districts, that we can do that actually build resiliency in your environment, and then they can mitigate factors in your environment. So I actually teach this. This is our graduate level course I teach through Penn. And so their final project is usually selecting one of these and really mining it. So how do I provide opportunities for meaningful participation? Believe it or not, children that struggle with resiliency in our classroom need to be participating even more actively. So it's not always, so you could take, these are very fascinating research here, and you could look at the research on each one of these. That could be, folks, your SLO for the year, selecting one of these and really kind of delving into it and doing some experimentation with your kids. So I am the poet. We're getting towards the end of class, but we're still in good shape here for this time, which is great. Does anyone know who wrote this piece of poetry? Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete, proving nature's law is wrong? It learned to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared. Someone gonna be the teacher's pet and tell me who wrote that? Let me check the chat. Is anyone, you're too shy, but you know, and you don't want to share? Mike, is anyone weighing in there?
Nothing yet, but I'm sure people are searching Google right now.
I was going to say.
Nikki said it could be you.
That just, I do write a lot of emo stuff, folks, as my kids would call it, like the emo poetry that I published. This is a nice piece of poetry out of, it's from Tupac Shakur.
Yep,
so
people are chiming in now.
Yeah, oh, now they're chiming in. And by the way, the without is not something that, like, he intentionally has that without. We know that without is one word. But I spoke earlier about reading about folks of resiliency, kind of like as models, especially for kids, and for us as well, like to really encourage us. I think it was Mike or Renee referenced me yesterday. Mike, like I am the purger. When it comes to the house, I am slowly, meticulously, room by room, clearing things out. And I was inspired by a book that my son, Andy, who teaches in South Korea, bought me, the Marie Kondo book. And so at first I thought, this is a bunch of hooey, you know, and she talks about, does this spark joy? But if it doesn't spark joy, let it go. The only thing I haven't done that with is my thousands of books that are sitting up in my office area. But using literature as a segue to foster our resiliency is an extremely powerful tool. So I don't want to linger over this too long, but I got to tell you, this was a piece of poetry that I taught high school, that my high school kids loved. So literature and choosing literature, whether it be for kindergarten with the books that we're using versus up through adults, is really, really powerful. So back to that poem, just very briefly. What is the theme of that poem? And I think that's kind of like, whoa, there could be multiple themes here. But when you're using literature or using real life examples of folks that have overcome things, overcome obstacles, if they actually, it's actually kind of bittersweet here if you know his life story, because where is Tupac now? Jeff, do you know?
I have no idea.
So it's really powerful. So Jeff would be a great student to research that after we take a look at this piece of poetry. He's dead. So he was murdered. But if you're teaching social studies, you're teaching whatever content, especially you're an art teacher, a music teacher, they have, I mean, Mozart, you know, there are so many different folks out there, and their works can act as kind of bringing to real life. So I had to throw the poem in there for you, okay? And the theme of that poem, guess what, is resiliency. So as we start to wrap up, and I want you to be able to create your own resiliency board, which you may or may not want to share. That's totally up to you. There are a couple things that we've indirectly tapped into over the last about 45 minutes. You need to cherish that social support and interaction. Even those of us, I myself personally am definitely an introvert. In order, if you are struggling, it's not enough to keep that, to take that all in internally. Treat problems as a learning process. I've worked with some of you folks extensively here and know you have just such a great sense of humor about things. Sense of humor is a strong, Helen, you're one of them. I'm looking right at that sense of humor is a strong resiliency factor. avoid making a drama out of a crisis, to celebrate the successes, which is so significant, looking at realistic life goals for the purpose, take positive action, and nurture a positive view of yourself. So I really do sound like Dr. Phil at this juncture, but this research on resiliency, as I said, is not something that I came up with, but for those of us that are struggling or have those moments or those patches where it's very rough, it's really something to keep in mind. So I wanted to end today with a resiliency inspiration board. I actually got this notion from my second son, and he's a teacher currently in South Korea. And Andy had, when he still lived at home in high school, he had an inspiration board. And kind of like quotes, pictures, things that were meaningful to him. And when I think about looking at our strengths and the things that really compel us or move us, and I've had teachers do this in the course that I teach, you could literally have your kids in the classroom all develop, it could be a virtual or a physical resiliency board. But I think even more importantly is that we develop our own, and you could model it for the kids if you're open to that, or more importantly, you have it somewhere present, very visible in your house, and you can change it out. And there are a couple tips, like I start with a quote so that I would define my resiliency quote and then move from there. But I have to tell you, if it's a prominent place where you personally say, mine is up in my office, mine's up in my den, and I'm looking at it on a regular basis. You want text, pictures, and words that inspire you. It might be pictures of people that are important to you if you're doing the actual physical board. Mine is a physical board, like a cork board. But you could do it, and that's what I was asking you, I wanted you to play around with. Just display it, just put it on a presentation slide. The last year I was in my classroom, before I left to become full-time at an IU, my kids had resiliency slides, and then we printed them out. And so it was kind of like, get to know them. What are the things you'd want people to know about you? And that sense of belonging is powerful. So I've definitely gotten better with old age, because as I said, I was not a sharer. But when you develop a board, the first thing I did, and I think that's kind of like the focus or anchor for your resiliency board, would be find a quote that speaks to you. So those of you that know me probably know, you wouldn't be surprised, oh, there's a Maya Angelou quote, because I love poetry. But I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it. That becomes a mantra. And so when you develop your own board, these are things in the center and the bottom, I do write daily. So I have the book, The Daily Poet. Lower right, those of you that know me know my children are incredibly important, as well as my sweetie there on the end. So that would be on my board. And my coaches, don't feel slighted if you're not on here, but this was over to the left. Stacy's on there. This was our PIC conference that we were at, the folks that were there. And I have to tell you, the greatest resiliency that I draw work-wise, and I'm not trying to be warm and fuzzy, would be number one, working with Mike and Renee. Number two is working with my coaches that I get to mentor, because they're amazing people. And some of you are here today, so I'm not saying that just because you're in the room. Honestly, working with educators in general is a lifeblood. Like it's gotten me through a lot of difficult challenges. And on the upper right, I love to garden. So I know that this is a very personal kind of activity, but you can get where, like I said, at home, I have a board. It's a cork board. Would you folks, is there anyone that would like to at least spend a couple moments Googling and see if you can find, like for the start, for the germ or the seed of your resiliency board, Google quotes. Or if you might already have a quote, and if there's anyone then that would like even to throw it onto a slide and share the screen with us before we leave, that would be awesome. I did have, I think that when you're looking at this for self-affirmation and to really I think your quote says a lot about your resiliency factors as well. Keeping in mind your strengths. So how about we give you, Mike's good with the music, but I won't make him do it if he doesn't have it prepared. But how about we give you folks like 3 minutes and see if you can define or even Google a quote. And you could Google resiliency quotes or quotes to inspire. but something that speaks to you individually, because that's the idea behind the resiliency boards. Does that sound like a plan? Okay. Who doesn't love a little REM there? Okay. So I'm seeing some quotes over in the chat, folks. They're wonderful. So that, and then you're a person after my own heart there with Maya. If you don't like something, change it. If you can't change it, then change your attitude. And that's kind of very, very much where some of us are aligned. Did anyone, because I would really highly recommend, I know it sounds so warm and fuzzy, I would highly recommend during these times creating your board, and particularly with the quotes that you begin with. Jeff had a great one too. Ashley had a great one. Start where you are. Oh, every time you find humor in a difficult situation, you win. And I have to tell you, that's, some of us are definitely, that could be a defense mechanism, but for many of us, like I use a lot of self-deprecating humor because you can't be so serious about yourself. So with this Helen's, my barn having burned down, I can now see the moon. I love that one. I absolutely love that one. So the idea of creating the board is the positive reminder. So I hope that you can see that, or I mean, as I said, this is definitely, I'm going to go back for a second, folks. It's definitely kind of the notion of where we're at, and some days are definitely better than others, but that there is a beginning and there is an end. And those folks that are and do practice, I do a lot of mindfulness work too. When you're doing that, you're understanding that life is absolutely, and resiliency, life is part of that journey. The path is not always linear. I will share something, particularly for my coach Lynn, and myself, I've been a 2-time cancer survivor. I can tell you that it's not like you are I'm not some like Herculean, like strong, I'm just like a 58-year-old woman, you know? But I have to tell you, the truth of the matter is the reading, my family, and particularly through a lot of days, 40 days, consecutive days of a treatment that I had to receive, music. was absolutely like the savior. So it's different for every single person, but it's definitely worth the development of the time on yourself and devoting that time to yourself to develop the board. And I do have to apologize, Mike Baker. I do not want you to think that you or Renee are not significant. I just didn't have, our picture of us was not very flattering. So that's why you weren't on the board, because it wasn't one of our better pictures that we had recently. Do you have any questions? Because there are folks, absolutely, like I said, this is an entire, if you go back to that wheel and the different 6 components, you could take those and study those. That is a course that I teach, but you don't have to take a course to do that. If you like the reading, I would highly recommend, it was the quote, the Horacio Sanchez book, any of his books. It's Sanchez. His books are wonderful, and his first name is Horacio. Nan Henderson's work is kind of the integral work, but it seems a little dated at points at this point. Questions or concerns? Mike, Renee, do we have any?
Just lots of positive comments over there, and thank yous.
Yeah, I would highly recommend, and I know it's like, oh, okay, I'm done with the session. I would highly recommend taking your quote, running with it, development of a board. And it really says a lot about yourself, but it's daily affirmation that we all have our strengths. And I hope that you all have a great rest of the day. And remember to teach and work with your strengths rather than always obsessing over our deficits or the things that we could do better. Thank you very much.